Alright, so I'm Terry Pratchett. Yes, I know, Damon, but just pretend, okay? Just pretend. I have a healthy irreverence for stock fantasy tropes, and I've learned from past efforts that my most humorous moments tend to come from a group of characters bickering, rather than situational comedy or slapstick. However, sorcery seems to have demonstrated that repeating the same thing over and over again leads to diminishing returns. And most of the characters I've written have all got a happy ending now, so it would be cruel to make them all face the same fate as Rincewind. So, where do I go with my next book? Well, I've still got a hankering to do something with the ideas I espoused in Why Gandalf Never Married. The sexism in fantasy is still a thing, and I won't exactly solve it with characters like Konina, so how can I take another axe to the issue? I suppose Granny and Nanny from Equal Rights could still do more. I mean, they certainly contrast each other. And if I added a third witch, like a trainee witch who's read too much Margaret Murray, and she has this really warped idea of what witching actually is, that would be neat. And I would show up Gerald Gardner, the putz. Yeah. And hey, if it's three witches, then that's like Macbeth. And if it's like Shakespeare, then, that's a whole new sacred cow that I can play with. Yeah, that's it. That's perfect. Oh, by the way, I've absolutely no idea if this was Terry Pratchett's actual thought process when he came up with Wyrd Sisters. It's just something that makes sense given what you will get from this book. What is Wyrd Sisters? Wyrd Sisters is the story of Esme, Granny, Weatherwax, Githa, Nanny, Og, and Magrat Garlic. Three witches living in Lonker, a small, insignificant country that is basically Liechtenstein. One day, the Lonker king is killed by his cousin at the behest of his ambitious wife, and while Granny Weatherwax insists on not meddling in the affairs of people, the witches eventually realize that remaining neutral will cause irreparable harm to Lonker under the new king's cruel rule. As such, they devise a way for the old king's son to fulfill a magic destiny and take back the throne. However, fate and destiny soon prove to be far less manageable than any of the witches suspected, and their seemingly foolproof plan quickly goes awry. How does the world of Wyrd Sisters work? While the Kingdom of Lonker first appeared in Equal Rights, this is the first book to really explore the place, going into detail about its geography, politics, and people. It's basically Liechtenstein, but English, so, Lancashire? The point is, it's a tiny, insignificant plot of land surrounded by mountains whose people just sort of tolerate the king, even when he goes full tyrant and starts chopping off heads. This is also the first Discworld book to establish the dynamic of its titular trio. While some points of characterization had yet to be ironed out, Granny is now closer in resemblance to the unflappable crone of later books, Nanny is less languid and lethargic and more outright bawdy and bold, and Magrat is basically every doe-eyed, awkward gal who would have fit right in with the flower power crowd if she hadn't been born years after such a crowd had well and truly died. The quandary of meddling with things, and using magic to make the world a better place, a major moral issue of later books, also makes its first proper thematic appearance in this book, which leads us to ask, what does Wyrd Sisters have to say? Quite a bit, though you wouldn't suspect it. Indeed, this would mark the beginning of Terry Pratchett using the Discworld not simply to examine fictional tropes, but how those tropes influence the real world. Through the character of Magrat Garlic and her bickering with Granny and Nanny, Pratchett systematically mocks or dismantles many of the tenets of Wicca, which many people still think is the continuation of an ancient tradition, but is actually the 20th century invention of a rich Englishwoman. I will admit, the sorcerer does look really cool, albeit slightly familiar. Questions for later. To get back on track, the criticism is presented in a more lighthearted and joking manner than when Pratchett would deal with witches in later books, to the point where you might not even notice it if you aren't already familiar with Wicca's actual origins and Pratchett's dim view of them. But what may come off as simple character bickering is actually a pretty sophisticated dig at New Age mysticism, which would be a frequent target for Pratchett's mockery over the course of his works. Alongside this, Pratchett demonstrates a deep knowledge not simply of Shakespeare's plays themselves, but of the historical context they were written in and the social messages they gave. Many people know Macbeth as a play, but fewer know him as a real-world historical figure, or as a propaganda piece to give legitimacy to the reign of King James VI and First. Yeah, I know, he was the 6th and the 1st, it's complicated. However, Pratchett uses the witches and the traveling performers of Wyrd Sisters as a means to delightfully skewer these facts, and to discuss how a lot of what we think to be objective history is really just controlled fiction. I think the best way to describe Wyrd Sisters is that it's full of genius bonuses. There's a lot that might fly over your head, but which is still fun enough that even if you don't get it, you'll still have a good time. Unlike with earlier books, knowing all the references isn't actually necessary for you to enjoy the story. It's just icing on the cake. Final verdict. Wyrd Sisters tends to get brought up as a good starting point for the series because it's the first proper Lonker Witches book, which is one of the more popular subseries. However, I think it's a good place to start not only because of that, but because it's the book to examine not simply fiction and tropes, but what they mean and what significance they carry in the real world, discussing the role that theater and fiction play in propaganda and identity. It's not to the same depth and nuance as his best work, but it's the start of something fascinating. And for that, I would give Wyrd Sisters the first 8 out of 10 for the Discworld series. From all that, you're probably expecting things to get even better, but I'm afraid there's still one more book we need to cover first. Until then, I'm Mark O'Keen, signing off, and I hope you liked this video. If you did, and you'd like to see me make more, please leave a like or comment down below, share my video via Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or other means, and subscribe to my channel.